We're back to talk about my dad's latest book, Path Lit by Lightning, The Life of Jim Thorpe. Jim Thorpe, a member of the Sac and Fox Nation, has been called the greatest athlete the world has ever seen. He won gold in the decathlon and pentathlon of the 1912 Olympic Games. He mesmerized fans and sports writers on the football field, and he traveled the world with professional baseball. This book on Jim Thorpe is my father's third sports biography. He wrote, of course, When Pride Still Mattered, A Life of Vince Lombardi, Clementi, The Passion and Grace of Baseball's Lost Hero, and now Path Lit by Lightning, The Life of Jim Thorpe. Athletic myths, my dad writes, are made by the desire to rise above life's ordinariness and associate with the transcendent. Myths at once distort a specific reality and fill a human need, revealing a larger truth. That truth is what we're going to talk about in these podcasts. Well, Dad, it feels like it's been about 10 years since we did the last podcast.
What was it, 2 years? 1 year? Anyway,
I don't know.
Happy to do it again.
You've created a book, I guess, since we last talked. And so today we're going to talk about how you researched and wrote the book, which is on Jim Thorpe, titled Jim Thorpe, Path Lit by Lightning.
Or the other way around.
Path Lit by Lightning.
The Life of Jim Thorpe.
The Life of Jim Thorpe. Got it. I was going to start by asking you who was Jim Thorpe, just to help, put it all in context. And then I thought the question really is, who is Jim Thorpe? Even though he's no longer living, it seems like this is a case where myth and man are so interwoven, and each has its purposes, that it's not just, the sort of the finite life of an individual, but the meaning of the life, which is continuous. So who is Jim Thorpe?
Jim Thorpe is an American myth and a great American figure. He was the greatest athlete of the first half of the 20th century, arguably the greatest American athlete ever. He was a Native American, a member of the Sac and Fox Nation from Oklahoma. He was from the same clan and perhaps a descendant of the famous Sac and Fox Indian Black Hawk. His mother told him that he was the reincarnation of Black Hawk. And he did things on the athletic fields that no one has ever done since. He was an Olympian who won 2 gold medals in 1912. He was an All-American football player, one of the first great star and founding president of the National Football League, and a Major League Baseball player. So in that sense, he could do anything. And he transcended sports and became a mythic figure in American life for all of those reasons.
So for this podcast, we're going to talk about how you wrote the book, which I suppose people can start to order. It comes out in August of this summer, so that's exciting, but it's already on Amazon.
It's August 9th.
Okay. August 9th. Wow, that really is soon. About almost a full month from today as we record this, in fact. So pretty cool. Before we get into how you wrote the biography of Jim Thorpe, I thought it was kind of interesting that you said that as you talk to people of your generation, many of them will say, oh, I read a book about him in 4th grade. So did you read a book about him when you were in 4th grade?
I haven't been able to find the library card, but I'm pretty sure that I did. I read books about Babe Ruth, Jackie Robinson, and Jim Thorpe, sort of the mythic figures of American sports. That's what I loved to read when I was in elementary school. But I really didn't know the story. I remember that I knew that he was an American Indian and that he was sort of cool looking and that he was a great athlete. So yes, I mean, I was one of those kids who read about him in fourth grade, but fourth grade for me was a long, long time ago, Sarah.
Right. Yeah. Well, but it can be, I think one of the reasons it's significant in this story is that sometimes, in terms of our knowledge of these bigger than life figures, the first impression comes when we're young, and then everything else either fits into that mold or disproves it. And one of the things you've done with your research is look into the veracity of these stories that might have been in some of those books for fourth graders, you know, and so for contemporary readers, there might be that interest in how their first impression and first introduction to Jim Thorpe, you know, is confirmed or changed.
Yeah, that goes in two ways, sort of. I mean, in one way, you know, for a lot of reasons, especially in that era when I was growing up, books for children were sort of sanitized, so that the story of Jim Thorpe was one just of heroism, of his athletic accomplishments, without really dealing in any sort of contextual depth the struggles that he went through, both in his personal life and dealing with American society. So that's one part of the myth. The other part is to not just glorify Jim Thorpe, but repeat stories about him, like sort of like George Washington chopping down the cherry tree, or Babe Ruth pointing to where he was going to hit his home run in the All-Star game. You know, things that likely did not happen, but reflect sort of the way that someone is revered by society in retrospect.
And that makes me think, too, that sometimes books are written after a life has already been defined in the sense of the greatest athlete in the world. Mm-hmm. And one thing that I think most of your biographies do, but of course this one is sort of show the way in which someone becomes an athlete or becomes named the greatest athlete. And the idea of becoming and the uncertainty involved and the sort of the struggle, that it's, you know, that a person's ultimate accomplishments aren't a given, but that they, in a sense, unfold. And you talk about potential a lot and the idea of his potential as a young man. But I want to start with talking about how you, doing any of those things, you have to become obsessed with a subject, as you say. So when did the seed or the sort of obsession and desire to spend the next couple of years of your life working on this happen, and how?
Sarah, I'll answer that, but let me first get back to what you said about sort of not knowing what's going to happen in someone's life. That's the first key to understanding how to write biography, that lives are lived forward, but biographies are written from looking backward. So you have to try to write looking forward, not knowing what's going to happen next. There are occasions when I will foreshadow something, but for the most part, the way I have to approach it and the way the reader has to approach it is that you don't know what's going to happen next, and there's no givens in anyone's life. All of it is uncertainty until it happens. But it all seems certain after you've written it. So to get back to your question about sort of what obsessed me about Jim Thorpe, it took a long time for this to happen. I'd written two other sports biographies about sports figures, which I would only write because they're about more than sports. The first was about Vince Lombardi, When Pride Still Mattered. And in that case, my obsession was looking at sort of the mythology of competition and success in American life, what it takes and what it costs. And also, how does someone become a leader? Why is someone a leader? What were Lombardi's skills as a leader? And using his dramatic life as the great football coach, perhaps the greatest in NFL history, to examine those questions. And also American society during the period of his life, from 1913 to 1970. Roberto Clementi was my chance to write about the Latino experience in America, and about that rare athlete who was growing as he was getting older, as his talents might have been diminishing, and he offered so much more than just sports. He, like Lombardi, transcended sports and died a truly heroic figure, trying to deliver humanitarian aid to Nicaragua after an earthquake. So many sports figures are called heroes, but what did they do off the athletic fields? So Thorpe, in that sense, is sort of the third part of my trilogy of American sports figures. And for me, I saw it not just as an opportunity to write about this incredibly dramatic life, but to use his life as a means of really exploring the Native American experience through his accomplishments and his struggles, his perseverance and his difficulties. The seed was planted almost 2 decades ago. I was in Denver on a book tour, and one of the people at the Denver Press Club that day was a man named Norbert Hill from the Oneida Nation in Wisconsin. And he came up to me after my presentation and said, "Dave, I've got your next book for you. You got to write about Jim Thorpe." And I think he even handed me some documents that he had about Jim Thorpe. Now that was 20 years ago or so. And at the time I had several other books lined up, and it wasn't really on my radar screen. But the seed was planted, and it grew and grew, and finally I realized that this was the book that I wanted to write, and it took another almost 20 years before I started it.
Wow. So the seed was planted, and then it grew. Jim Thorpe, if I have this right, was born in 1887,
Yes.
and he died in 1953. You were born in 1949.
Right.
And I think he died early enough in 53 that you were not yet 4. So you were somewhere in your 3s as a toddler. So just putting that in context, you've written about other figures, obviously, who sort of fading into the past, the memories of them, the people who were contemporaries with them dying and so forth. So to write this book, you would have to start your research, in a sense, with obviously more than a half century after he died, Jim Thorpe died, and most people who knew him intimately no longer alive. So where do you start? Where do you literally start?
Well, you're absolutely right that none of his family members, none of his children were alive when I started this book. Most of his grandchildren were not around. So we're dealing with great-grandchildren, but I never start with the family in a situation like this. So where do I start? Before I literally started, I wanted to sort of understand the grounds that I was going to be covering. And so my first call was to Patty Lowe, who I had known from her days in Wisconsin as a great journalist here and professor at the University of Wisconsin. And she had gone on to found the Indigenous Studies Research Department at Northwestern University, your old school, Sarah. Mm-hmm. So, I wrote to Patty and said, I'm thinking of doing a book on Jim Thorpe. How do you feel about that? And one of my sensibilities is, I'm a white male. I'm writing about a Native American. Am I the one to do this book? And she wrote back, yes, yes, yes. She was very excited that I would undertake this. She'd read some of my other books. So that encouragement really meant an enormous amount. If she had said no, I might not have done this book, to be honest with you. Mm-hmm. And then from then on, Patty was sort of a resource for me as I was doing my research in terms of understanding certain nuances of the Native American experience. I could always go to her if I had a question about that. Mm-hmm. My next call, again, was not really directly related to the Thorpe biography, but it was to Suzanne Shawn Harjo, who lives in Washington, who I had known for more than probably 40 years. I remember she used to come to the Post back when I was a young reporter there and talk to one of my bosses, Howard Simons, who she was very close with, about Native American issues. And particularly, she'd been campaigning for decades against the name of the Washington football team. She was a leader of that movement to eliminate the disparaging mascots and nicknames for so many athletic teams. Suzanne Shawn Harjo was at the forefront of that movement. So I called her up and said, hey, I think I'm writing a biography about Jim Thorpe, and I'd love to talk to you. And she immediately had so much information for me about the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, where Jim went to school and gained his fame as a football player there. She had relatives who had attended Carlisle. She knew all about the founder of the school, Richard Henry Pratt, and sort of his, what she called civilizationist philosophy, as opposed to what earlier had been an exterminationist philosophy of just kill the Indians. Pratt's philosophy was kill the Indians, save the man, which meant take all of the Indianness out of them as the only way for them to survive. You know, a completely racist and disparaging philosophy, but nonetheless one that many white progressives at that time held. So Suzanne taught me about the Carlisle School. She had just a wealth of history about Oklahoma. Her family was from Oklahoma and the Indian Territory there. So I grounded myself first in I wanted this book, I want all of my books to be written as much as possible, not from me imposing a viewpoint onto the book, but to understand it from the inside out. And so I had to talk to as many Native Americans as I could first. And Suzanne was very key to that. I also went up to Yale very early in my first research trip really was to Yale.
And Dad, Yale
University, I'll explain why, but first I want to say that while I was there, I met with another important Native American scholar, Ned Blackhawk, who teaches Indigenous Studies at Yale, and talked to him about what I was doing and what he knew about Thorpe and so on. So I grounded myself first in that sort of place before I did any of my real research. And then because COVID hadn't hit yet, Sarah, so I was able to travel some. I was able to get to Yale. I was able to get to several other archives, but I always try to learn as much as I can before I talk to anybody who will have specific knowledge about events. And so I started with the research.
You know, the reason I asked Yale, isn't there a town, Yale, also that's prominent in the book?
Absolutely. That's, I guess, sort of an irony. But yeah, for a while, Jim Thorpe lived in Yale, Oklahoma. So this is the Beinecke Rare Book Archive and Library at Yale, which had several very important documents for me. It had all of the papers of the founder of the Carlisle Indian School, Richard Henry Pratt, which were... Is
that because he went there, or why were they...
because one of his daughters decided to give them to Yale. She lived in Connecticut.
Okay.
I mean, that Beinecke library has enormous... It's a great resource for things all over the world, really. And it happened to have those papers. It also had the papers of a great Native American writer, or just a great writer who happens to be Native American, N. Scott Momaday, who is from the Southwest, but was fascinated by the Carlisle School and by Thorpe, and wrote, he wrote a lot of great things about the boarding school experience nationally. But he wrote a specific play that was not produced and a screenplay for a movie, sort of built around Carlisle during the Jim Thorpe era. So to read everything that he had researched, at that archive, really get grounded again in Carlisle, which I considered sort of the heart of my book, the boarding school experience. That was the first research I did. And then there's another connection that came through Suzanne Sean Harjo that you might want to ask me about.
Yeah, and I was going to get to that later, but I'll do that now. So in speaking with these experts who you turn to understand from the inside out the Native American experience, I'm sure that led to other experts from there. And I know you've said that Suzanne Schoen Harjo opened the door to someone else. Who was that?
Yeah, she really did. We were talking and she said, my dad, she said, once met the great man, Jim Thorpe. And there was someone who was interested in writing about Thorpe who had interviewed my father about that experience. So, I thought that's a little teeny bit, but I want to find out who that was. So I said, well, who was that? She said, it was David Hurst Thomas, who was a great anthropologist, archaeologist, who worked at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. It turned out that David Hurst Thomas was also on the board of directors of the National Museum of American Indians in Washington at the Smithsonian, which was also, Susan was also on, and that's how they met. In any case, I contacted David up in New York and told him that, I'd heard that he'd interviewed Suzanne's father about Jim Thorpe, and, did he have a transcript of that interview? And he said, well, I might have it somewhere, but why don't, if you're ever in New York, stop by and we can talk. So I went up to New York, and, what a grand old building that museum is, up off Central Park West. And his office is up on the 5th floor in sort of a turret-like part of the building. And I went into his office, and it was lined with artifacts of his life as a anthropologist and archaeologist, and just a student of Native American life. And there were books everywhere, and globes and maps, and he had this old desk, and he was wearing cowboy boots, and he had his boots on the desk. And he told me it turned out it was the desk that had belonged to Margaret Mead, the great anthropologist, who also worked at that museum. He once was her boss. Anyway, so we're talking for about an hour or two, and this experience had happened to me once before in my life, but in any case, he told me about interviewing Suzanne's father and meeting Jim Thorpe, but then he said, I was obsessed with Jim Thorpe. I spent years wanting to write a biography of Jim Thorpe. But for various reasons, I couldn't figure it out. I couldn't do it. And I've read your book on Vince Lombardi. He said that David had once worked for Al Davis of the Oakland Raiders, and he loved football. And he thought it was just incredible serendipity that I would come along and be interested in Thorpe. And he said, I have 8 boxes of material that I accumulated researching a book that I never wrote.
Wow.
I would love for you to have them. If you can write this book, that would be great. So Something like that had happened to me with the Roberto Clementi book.
Yeah,
where
we talked about that with
yes,
the lawyer
yeah,
and the
we had
plane.
all of the old documents about Clementi's plane crash. Anyway, so I went up to New York at that time on the train, so I didn't have any means of taking all of those boxes. But very shortly thereafter, I called my friend Chip Brown, another writer who lives in New York, and told him what I was doing. I was coming up to New York with my station wagon, and would he help me load all these boxes? And he, of course, jumped at the chance to go up to the 5th floor of the museum and see all these things. And so we loaded everything up, and I inherited, at least temporarily, the David Hurst Thomas archive on Jim Thorpe, which was invaluable to me. I mean, I tried to treat it just like any other archive, like the Beinecke or any of the others that I went to. But that material was really, very early on in my research, I had sort of the gold that I needed for the book.
Well, that reminds me also of the Bill Clinton research when you would go around and someone would serve you some sort of homemade concoction and then go up to the attic and bring down letters, if I'm recalling that.
That happened in Hope, Arkansas. A woman who claimed she was Bill's great aunt, or was Bill's great aunt.
Right.
It took me home because she felt sorry for me because I was allergic to the mimosa trees blooming in the springtime of Southwest Arkansas. And after we were talking, she brought down this box of letters of Bill Clinton's mama, his grandma. So yes, I consider that, I've written about in various books, including this one, a baseball figure named Branch Rickey, whose most famous saying was, "Luck is the residue of design." Mm-hmm. And in all of my books, I've been lucky, but I do consider it a residue of the design of what I do. And
I think
getting those boxes from David Hurst Thomas.
I think a big part of that design is your motto, if we could use that word, to go there. And going there, that there's not always the geographical place where your main subject lived, but the individual people who are connected. So you go to the Natural History Museum, or you go to these offices or the houses, and then someone there is invaluable. But let's talk a little bit about the theirs. So going there, besides, in a sense, sort of the human theirs of going to the Native American experts, after that, and the library and the archives, Carlisle, Pennsylvania is a significant part of the story of Jim Thorpe, and in many ways also a window into, I think, the treatment of Native Americans during a certain period of time. Yes. So how did you go to Carlisle, and also how did you then find the record of what Carlisle was when Jim Thorpe was there, which was that in just the turn of the century that he got there?
He got there in 1904, and he was there until 1912, the end of 1912. Okay.
Right.
Most of that period, he was at Carlisle. There were some gaps, interesting gaps. One
significant.
Gap, very significant. So, yes, in this case, this book for me, Sarah, was different than any one I've done in terms of the go there experience because of COVID. This was really my COVID book. I was able to get to most of the archives before COVID arrived in March of 2020, but I wasn't able to get everywhere. So I got to most of the places of Jim Thorpe's life, except I never got to Stockholm, where he was in the Olympics. But Carlisle I did get to. And it was during COVID that I got there, very carefully. But there's a wonderful, everywhere I go, there are always sort of people who unlock the doors for me. And in this case, it was a great historian and archivist from the Cumberland County Historical Society named Barbara Landis, who knows, she's just a walking encyclopedia of knowledge about the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. And so when I went up there, she was my tour guide, in both, in terms of knowledge and of looking around and seeing it. And the interesting thing about that school is that, it's been closed for more than 100 years. They closed it in 1918 when the Army, which it had originally been an Army barracks, wanted it back to make it a hospital for during World War I. And so soldiers went there to recuperate from wounds. So that's when the Indian school closed. And yet, more than a century later, almost all of the remnants of that school are still there. The dorm where Jim Thorpe slept, the superintendent's house, the gym, the playing field, most of the buildings, where the house where his coach Pop Warner lived.
Wow.
All of that is still there. So when you tour those grounds, you can almost feel you can almost hear the voices from 100 years past. And then, by far the most haunting experience at that school is the Indian cemetery. The first students who went to Carlisle in 1879, when it was founded, were Lakota Sioux from South Dakota. And this was only 3 years after the Battle of the Little Bighorn, where Custer had been wiped out by the Sioux and some of their allies, Native American allies. And so the government's idea was to bring many of the sons and daughters of those rebellious, quote unquote, rebellious Indians east and reform, train them, take the Indian, kill the Indian, save the man. One of those Indians, Luther Standing Bear, who later became a writer, said he thought he was going to Carlisle to die. He thought he was being sent there to show his bravery and that he would die. It turns out he did not die, but so many of those young students did die over the course of the from 1879 to 1918, that whole period when the school was there. So there's this cemetery with more than 180 tombstones of the children of the Indians who were, the children who were sent there. And it's truly a haunting experience to look at that cemetery and think about not just the reality of what it meant for those young people to be sent away from their families, often taken against their will, against the will of their families to this place. Not always, but often that was the case. Living in a completely alien environment, their hair shorn, their clothes changed, that they had to wear, ironically, uniforms that mimicked the U.S. cavalry that had chased and killed their ancestors. They weren't allowed to speak their native languages. They could not practice their own religions. They were all, trained, inculcated in Protestantism. All of that sort of is evoked in this cemetery where their bones are. And only in the last 6 or 7 years, or even not even that long, have any of them been repatriated. The U.S. government resisted, the military resisted the idea of the native nations taking those children back home to where they came from until recently, and that's started in the last few years. But I would say that going to that cemetery and really sort of infusing myself in that was one of those moments that I've had in all of my books where I really feel the history sort of soaking through.
You mentioned this being your first and hopefully only COVID book, and not being able to go to Stockholm, which is obviously where the 1912 Olympics took place. But also, is it correct that that's where the medals that Jim Thorpe won? They're in Switzerland, aren't they? The actual medals.
The medals are in Lausanne, Switzerland, where the International Olympic Committee headquarters are. Mm-hmm. I wished I could have gotten to Stockholm. The stadium still stands. Wow. It's a beautiful old brick stadium. It's still there. The Swedish have a wonderful sports museum. I was able to get some material from that long distance, but I would have loved to have gone there.
So how did you? Oh, sorry.
But
yes.
Once again, in this case, I did go there. I went there virtually in an incredible way. I discovered that the International Olympic Committee had conscripted a wonderful documentarian named Adrian Wood to find the old film from that Olympics. And there was tons of it, done by a Swedish film company and the Path newsreel company. Hours and hours of film. And he found it all, accumulated it, took it out to Burbank, California, put it through these, I have no idea about the technical aspects of it, but somehow he was able to sort of revivify that film and translate it into what would look like a modern film where it's not so herky-jerky, but you can actually see what's going on in real time. And there was hours and hours of it, including some film of Jim Thorpe getting his medals from the King Gustav V of Sweden. But just watching, I watched everything, all 2 hours of the documentary that he made. And from the opening scenes where you see the people in the streets of Stockholm parading down to the stadium, the businessmen in their white-tail, tuxedos, white-tie tuxedos, and the women in their incredibly beaux arts dresses and hats. And then all of the athletes, from the swimmers and divers to the equestrians. There was even a tug of war in the Olympics in 1912. I got to feel all of that. I felt like I was there watching those Olympics, which I couldn't have done by going to Stockholm in 2021 or 2020. But going back to 1912 into that documentary really made me feel that I was there.
I was going to say, you actually went there. You went to 1912 Stockholm. I watched part of that documentary after you mentioned it. And just as a woman, I noticed what the women were wearing, spectators, remembering it's the Summer Olympics. And yes. You talk about the heat, and it's so interesting to see these. Part of it is the time, 1912, and the formality, but just marveling at the spectators, and even some of the men assisting, recording time and that sort of thing. They're dressed in such heavy garments, it looks like. And obviously there were some athletes who suffered because of the heat,
yes.
But you wonder about the other people then.
Well, nobody was wearing shorts and T-shirts.
Except, I wanted you to explain your T-shirt and its connection to 1912. Do you have the cover of the book?
I do.
Okay.
Yes. This is, I don't know. There you go.
Yeah, pull it back a little bit now.
Okay,
yeah.
That's the same T-shirt and the same. Yes, he's wearing the T-shirt that I'm wearing. It was the official shirt of the American athletes at those Olympics.
Yeah. And we'll talk about this in another podcast, but one of the parts of the Olympics that were so interesting, and I don't know where you found the research for this, but the idea that the American teams or the athletes would travel to Switzerland on a steamship, right?
Sweden, yes.
Sweden, sorry, on a steamship, and that it had to be outfitted to help them train while they were on the ship for that. Was it about 6 days or so?
They went from New York Harbor to Antwerp, Belgium, right, and then through up into Scandinavia to Stockholm. So, one of the things that's happened, Sarah, since I researched my first book, which was about Bill Clinton in the 1990s, was the digitization of so many newspapers that are accessible online. In the old days, I used to go to libraries and crank out the microfilm for hours on end, for days on end, to get what I was looking for. And now, I can go to newspapers.com or genealogybank.com and type in a name and a date or a series of dates and come up with just scores of stories from that period about what I'm looking for. So, there were probably, and there were so many newspapers in that era, probably 15 just in New York City alone. And many of them were covering those Olympics. Many of the journalists were on board that ship at that time. So I got, on-the-scene reports of what was going on that ship from the newspapers of that era mostly. Also from some diaries that people kept, and interviews, oral histories of people who were athletes then. And one key one for me, and key throughout the book, was Avery Brundage, who later became the president of the International Olympic Committee, was truly sort of Jim Thorpe's nemesis throughout his life, constantly refusing to acknowledge that Thorpe deserved to have those medals and trophies back. But in 1912, Avery Brundage was a mediocre athlete who somehow made the Olympic team as a decathlete, the same event that Jim Thorpe competed in. And Brundage has an incredible archive at the University of Illinois, which he attended. And I went there before COVID and spent a significant amount of time there going through his archive. And one of the things there is an unpublished autobiography or memoir. And there's a whole chapter on him going to Stockholm for those Olympics. And so that was very helpful as I was sort of constructing that chapter on the Olympics.
So Avery Brundage was finally helpful.
Yes.
As a person who seems to be never helpful in all of your books.
He's been a villain in at least two of my books. I mean,
right.
And notorious, first of all, for conspiring with the Nazis to disparage any attempts to boycott the 1936 Olympic Games in Berlin, spreading a lot of false propaganda, Goebbels' propaganda about how great Germany was and it was treating its Jews well and all of this, complete fake news of that era. Avery Brundage was part of that, buying into it. In 1912, interestingly, he made two close friends in Stockholm, and they were both Germans who were then instrumental in 1936 in developing the Berlin Games and the propaganda of those games. So he bought into it from an early age. But yes, he was very helpful in my creating those Stockholm Olympics.
I think the other interesting thing about the 1912 Olympics, And you place it in context of Jim having already played football at Carlisle and against Army. And so you say after the 1912 Olympics, within a few months, Jim Thorpe had encountered three men who would become the most famous American generals of World War II. So there was another guy at the Olympics too. Well, no, who else was at the Olympics that Jim Thorpe encountered?
Well, there was another event called the Modern Pentathlon, which was an event that tried to sort of recreate what it would be like to be a soldier of an earlier era. So it was equestrian, running, swimming, and rifle shooting. And the American entry was George S. Patton, who was on the ship with Jim. He wrote about his experience in Stockholm in a less than accurate fashion, I'll say. And when you read that chapter, you can see how he sort of fudged what happened to him and what he did there. But yes, so George S. Patton, one of the great generals of World War II, was an Olympian with Jim Thorpe. And later that year, in the fall of 1912, Jim Thorpe played his greatest football game, the most meaningful in the history of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. It was Carlisle against West Point, the Indians against the Army. And Carlisle whooped them 27-6. It was an incredible game. And a linebacker and halfback on that Army team was Dwight David Eisenhower, who actually spent much of the game trying to injure Thorpe and knock him out of the game. As it turned out, it was the other way around. And Eisenhower is the one who suffered an injury that helped was the start of the end of his football career. On the bench in that game for Army was a freshman, Omar Bradley. So you had the three great generals of World War II all encountering Jim Thorpe and losing to him in various ways in 1912.
Well, we'll talk about this in the next podcast when we talk about more of the substance of the book and not how you wrote it. But I created a separate list, basically, of cameos with famous cultural touchstones. And it's, it's a huge list. And it's everything from, King Gustav V, Dwight Eisenhower, and then, obviously, Babe Ruth, Jim, Bob Hope. It just goes on. And so you see Jim Thorpe navigating this era. It's so fascinating that as today, athletes often intersect with the celebrities of the time, but not just celebrities, but soldiers or other people who would go on to big things. And there's Jim Thorpe, as you say, sort of indefatigable, never giving up, and just kept going and going. Into the Hollywood phase as well. And at what point in your research did you finally watch, or I should say, maybe you'd watched it before, but when did you watch the Hollywood movie with Burt Lancaster playing Jim Thorpe?
It was one of the first things I did, Sarah.
Really? That surprises me.
Yeah. No, I watched it early, but I didn't know. I was just watching it as a movie at that point. And then after I actually had studied what happened with that movie and knew everything about Pop Warner, his coach, and the contradictions of that, complexities of that relationship, because in the movie, Pop Warner is presented as the savior, the wise man. If only Jim Thorpe had followed his directions, he would have been much more successful in his later life after athletics. And I didn't know much when I watched it the first time. Then I watched it probably 10 or 11 times after that as I was writing the chapter. There's a whole chapter in the book called Have You Seen the Movie?, which is about that movie, a Jim Thorpe All-American, which came out in 1951. And I deconstructed. And it's very important in the deconstruction of that movie to understand Pop Warner's hypocrisy. And we'll talk about that in the next podcast. But Pop Warner was one of several important, influential white leaders who turned away from Jim Thorpe in his most difficult moment when the medals were about to be taken from him, and lied to save their own reputations.
That seems like almost a sort of a professorial way of approaching the movie, to have your students watch it in the beginning of a class and teach them the history, and then have them watch that same movie at the end and see how their perceptions have changed of the movie.
I mean, mine definitely did. I mean, I like Burt Lancaster. I consider him a real movie star, in the old-fashioned sense. And Lancaster was also a very good athlete. So he could portray Thorpe's athletic skills, even though he was, I think, 36 or 37 when they filmed the movie, and Jim Thorpe's supposed to be at least a decade younger than that or more. But he still pulled it off in that sense. But he's not Native American, not even close. So, in a lot of ways, it was typical of Hollywood of that era, the movie. And one of, we'll talk about Jim Thorpe in Hollywood next time, but his whole effort there was to try to persuade the powers that be to hire real Indians to play real Indians. And that wasn't the case so often in Hollywood.
You talk about Native Americans and you talk about Indians, and through your work and your conversations with the experts you referred to, as the rest of us are catching up in a sense, our sensibility and understanding of this big story, where do you fall in these words? And even the museum is the Museum of the American Indian, yes, if I'm not mistaken. So, and we'll talk more about, the other uses and other words that are starting to change. But how are we integrating both words, or do we, or what's It's
a very important question, and I haven't fully resolved it, to be honest with you. I mean, the most radical Indian movement was the American Indian movement of the 1970s and 80s, and that they called themselves Indians. Suzanne Shawn Harjo, who I greatly respect, calls herself an American Indian. Many people want to be called, indigenous. I use that a lot in the book. Indigenous people with a capital I. First Nations is used in Canada especially. And, I try to respect people for what they would like to be called. But in a book, you have to be faithful to the time you're writing about. And in the time I'm writing about, really Native Americans wasn't even that common. It was Indians. And so I'm not going to, if I'm writing about it in general, I'll use indigenous or Native American. If I'm writing about it, putting something in a specific time, it's Indian. And so, I try to be sensitive, but also not be unfaithful to the reality of what I'm writing about at that moment. And that's a sensitivity that authors have to deal with, and I try to respect all the different perspectives on it. Never use it. I mean, there's so many disparaging ways of labeling Indians, which are, apparent throughout my book when you read about how the press was characterizing them during the era of Thorpe's, all through Thorpe's life. Mm-hmm. But when I'm writing about it, it's more respectful.
I wanted to actually quote the press in a certain section. You include a quote from the, I think it is the Louisville Courier-Journal. Once in a while, across the vistas of the passing years, a dying race startles those who are measuring it for the shroud by giving a kick that grabs the entire funeral proceedings. The football season of 1911 has brought out prominently in the public eye another of these athletic marvels of a dying race and the greatest of them all. It goes on, of course, this is Jim Thorpe, and this is from 1911. What do you think? You place these types of summations, I guess, and two things strike me. One is that do sports writers still consider themselves, or do they write with this type of writing for history or to make pronouncements about the significance of things at this exact moment? Do you think, is that still a sort of a style or a,
Not quite. I mean, I think sports writers today have other flaws. But that was an era of grandiose purple prose. And so it was, there were some writers who could get away with it, and many who mimicked it, and it came off, like that. But it was fairly common. The reason I love that quote is because it's wrong.
Exactly.
And the one of the central threads of my book is how Jim Thorpe's perseverance echoed the perseverance of his people, that they did not die. They found a way to survive through all of what they endured over the centuries. And so, that quote sort of captures that feeling of that era, which was also evoked a little bit later in a statue called The End of the Trail, which was very popular, of an Indian sort of stooped on a horse, looking completely defeated. And that was supposed to evoke the end of that American progress, manifest destiny, had left these people behind, and they were, it was the end for the for Indians, and it wasn't true, and it didn't happen. Thank goodness.
You talk and write a lot about the duality of the dominant culture in trying to both mythologize and claim connection to Native Americans, at the same time diminishing and taking from.
Yes.
And that's a thread that you do talk about. And also, as with a lot of your other books about sports, are sort of what they or these figures teach us about our sort of understanding of race or color. And I wonder if you might talk a bit about how this was different than when you wrote about Roberto Clementi, or even the changes going on with what Lombardi as a coach saw with segregation and so forth. And so here we have an athlete from, whose heritage is Native American, and then navigating professional sports in a different way. What was going on there?
That's a really fascinating subject. And American Indians, Native Americans, indigenous people were treated separately from any other, in quotation marks, in American history. They were romanticized and diminished at the same time. They suffered genocide, horrible cruelty, at the same time that the people who were killing them or trying to make them white were romanticizing their nobility, the noble savage. They were treated completely differently from African Americans. Suffered, but it's fair to say, in the racist sensibility of white America, that many white Americans want to claim some Indian ancestry of some sort. You would never hear them doing that, trying to claim some African American ancestry. It'd be the opposite. What that means is sort of in the complexity of American history. But for instance, Black Hawk in 1832, Jim Thorpe's ancestor, when he was captured after the quote-unquote Black Hawk War, he was taken as a prisoner of war all the way through the United States, from Illinois to Washington, D.C. and down to Virginia, then up to New York and Baltimore. And he was paraded as this exotic figure. And the American press followed every move that he made, and hordes of people would turn out in every city to gawk at him. And you can't imagine any black figure of that era being treated in that similar way. Frederick Douglass is a separate issue, and that was a little later. But so there's always this sort of, American Indians could do things that Black Americans could not. They could play baseball in the major leagues. There were several American Indians who played. Jim Thorpe was one of them, at a time when there was a color line and no black players could play. Jim Thorpe in the 1940s, during the heat of the Jim Crow era, could travel through the South and be toasted by the touchdown club of Jackson, Mississippi. No African American could ever get in there except as a waiter. So there was that distinction. As much as Native Americans were discriminated against in so many other ways, subtle and unsubtle, it was different from the African American experience. And that was one of the many threads that I sort of explore throughout the book.
I want to circle back to the title of your book, Path Lit by Lightning, The Life of Jim Thorpe, and the significance of Path Lit by Lightning.
Well, it is a Sac and Fox phrase, and it is a poetic variation of his Indian name, often shorthanded to Bright Path, which I don't find interesting. But when I saw that it was more accurately Path Lit by Lightning, I said, well, that's my title. So it's, Wathohawk is the Sac and Fox language of Path Lit by Lightning.
And in a way, it's kind of, I guess, a metaphor of his life, but it's also, is it fair, am I remembering correctly, literal in the sense of when he was born?
Yeah, it's literal in that sense. I mean, there was a thunderstorm when he and his twin brother Charles were born, and so that's how he got that name. But it also, lightning, you look at that face and you see thunder and lightning.
Yeah. And there was one other person that you talked to who's related to this big topic, Jim Kosikowski.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, Jim
who is in fact Jim Thorpe Kosikowski, right?
That's exactly right. James Thorpe Kosikowski, a great-grandson.
How did you find him? Yeah.
Well, there's several great-grandchildren who are still alive. Most of them don't, they know the mythology of Jim Thorpe. They don't know the details of his life. But Jim Kosikowski grew up in Elgin, Illinois. And his grandmother, Gail, was one of Jim Thorpe's daughters. And Jim Kosikowski and his brother were both really good athletes. They were wrestlers, not football or baseball players so much. But Jim sort of became a repository for his great-grandfather's memorabilia and archives and some of that. So it was, he was the one descendant that I found was important for me to keep in touch with.
Path Lit by Lightning, The Life of Jim Thorpe is available online and at bookstores on August 9th. Visit davidmarinus.com to order your copy. This has been an episode of the David Marinus Ink in Our Blood podcast. We hope you enjoyed it and that you'll subscribe to the Ink in Our Blood podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or whichever podcast service you prefer. If you loved it, we'd love it if you left a rating and review. Ink in Our Blood is produced by Metamorphosis.agency. Music has been written and provided by Monica Ryan. Ink in Our Blood is hosted by Sarah Marinus Vanderschaff. Thank you for listening.